All right, we recording? All right, sorry about that, everyone. New stuff, doesn't work right. I'm not sure, I'm thinking we forgot also to plug in the other camera last weekend, and maybe it wasn't battery was a problem, I don't know. Anyway, regardless, you should have in front of you a set of notes for lesson 73. It's cold this morning in Michigan. My thing on my car said when I left my house it was -6. The closer we got to Grand Rapids, the warmer it got. So we'll see what happens. All right, lesson 73, materials and witnesses in the transmission of Scripture is what I've titled this, okay? Now let me say again, I said at the end of last week that we were going to do something different than what I've actually decided to do today. And the reason for that is I got really thinking about the order that I had set the lessons up in, and I decided that I didn't like the order and that it made more sense to do this first, okay, or to do this next after last week, okay? So if you look at point number 1, having dealt with functional or foundational aspects of transmission in lessons 70 through 72 by considering the importance of presuppositions and how they impact one's approach to textual criticism, we are now in a position to embark on a discussion of other basic matters related to the topic. Before laying out some principles for discerning, locating, or identifying the preserved text in history, we need to consider the following basic points regarding transmission. Number 1, materials used in transmission. Number 2, that should say witnesses to the New Testament text. 3, false assumptions concerning transmission. 4, we need to get rid of that one. We can just strike that next bullet, Sylvia, because we're actually doing that today. And then 4 would be scribal errors and corruption, okay? And look at, okay, well, what is that and how does that work? So in this lesson, we will consider the first 2 points, namely, materials used in transmission, and second, witnesses to the New Testament text, okay? So the first category, materials used in transmission. Bruce M. Metzger and Bart D. Ehrman are co-authors of a standard textbook on New Testament textual criticism titled, The Text of the New Testament, Its Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration. The first chapter is devoted to discussing the, quote, process involved in making and transcribing manuscripts, as well as, quote, the making of ancient books. At the outset, they note the following. They say, quote, until the invention of printing with movable type in the 15th century, the text of the New Testament was indeed the text of and indeed, the text of every ancient record could be transmitted only by laboriously copying it letter by letter and word for word, okay? I think everyone understands that, right? Until the invention of the printing press, the only way the Scriptures could have been transmitted is through hand what? Hand copies, okay? And that's just a fact of history. That's the way it is from the beginning of the inception of the New Testament in the 1st century all the way through till the invention of movable type by Gutenberg in the 1450s, okay? So that's just a fact that no knowledgeable person is going to dispute that in any way. While this point might be well known to most students of the New Testament, fewer have given much thought as to the materials upon which these transcriptions were made. Clay tablets, stone, bone, wood, leather, various metals, potsherds, papyrus, and parchment or vellum were all used in antiquity to receive writing. Among these several materials, the student of the New Testament is interested chiefly in the last 2, for almost all New Testament manuscripts are made of either papyrus or parchment, okay? So the surviving witnesses that we have to the New Testament are written on either papyrus or parchment, okay? So therefore we got to understand at least something about what those materials are, okay, and the comparable durability and other things related to them, okay. So once again, Metzger and Ehrman give an excellent summary of the origin and production of papyrus. So I'm on the top of page 2. They say, quote, papyrus is an aquatic plant that grows most successfully in the still shallows of marshlands. Its most inventive use was as a writing surface, perhaps the most influential achievement of the ancient Egyptians. To make a sheet of papyrus, these slices were placed vertically, side by side, on a hard wood plank or table with their edges slightly overlapping. On this first layer, another was put horizontally with slices running at right angles to the slice of the first layer. By pressing and beating, the two layers became one sheet, the plant's natural juices gluing the layers firmly together. The sheet thus made was dried under pressure. Lastly, the surface was polished with some rounded objects, possibly a stone, until it became perfectly smooth. The borders were then cut in order to make them straight and to give the sheet a rectangular shape. And sheets usually had a maximum height of about 15 inches and a maximum breadth of about 9 inches. So they take the papyrus, they lay it out, they spread it out flat, they hammer it together or press it together. The natural juices of the reed act as almost as a glue, and this is sort of like the first paper, and it's invented by the Egyptians, and this is what is going to be used primarily for the writing of the New Testament originally. Okay? While papyrus was abundant, easily shaped, and cheap, it was not necessarily very, very durable. As we have already seen in Lesson 68, Christians preferred codices over rolls or scrolls from very early in church history. Despite being brittle, papyrus could easily be fashioned into either a reed or a codex. Quote, initially papyrus books were not actually books at all, they were scrolls. And this presented some real durability problems because papyrus also wears out fairly quickly and easily. So it wasn't too long before people began to fold the papyri in order to form books. But the problem with this was that the pages were a bit brittle and did not fold easily. Soon, people were cutting the folds and forming what were referred to as a codex. So the early codices are made out of papyrus folded in half. Okay? When you fold the sheet in half, it kind of gets brittle. So eventually what they did is they would just cut those sheets, and then you would have, they write on one side, and then they write on the other, and then you would lay that down, and then you'd have the next sheet similar to what you have in a modern book. Okay? In the first century, when the apostles were penning the New Testament, papyrus was the main material upon which writing was committed. There's little doubt that the original autographs of the New Testament were originally written on papyrus. Materially, this helps explain why none of the original autographs have survived. I see no reason to doubt the fact that, for example, when Paul's originally writing Romans or Luke is writing Acts or whatever, I don't see any reason to doubt that they were originally written on papyrus as far as the material that they were written on. Okay? Around the 4th century, or the 300s, the use of papyrus was replaced with parchment or vellum. According to Metzger and Ehrman, quote, parchment or vellum was made from the skins of cattle, sheep, goats, and antelopes, especially from the young of these animals. Okay? They further state the two words, referring to parchment and vellum, are often used interchangeably, but exact writers restrict the word vellum to describe a finer, superior quality of parchment. Okay? So you could have parchment, and then you could have like fancy parchment. Same way you could have just today, right? You know, when I was sending out resumes trying to get a job, I didn't use plain old white paper. I used some fancy paper that would, you know, make me stand out or something like that, right? Okay? So you get the idea. There are functional reasons why parchment replaced the use of papyrus. They say, quote, even though it, referring to parchment, had a marked advantage over papyrus in its greater durability, moreover, it was better suited than papyrus for writing on both sides. It was at about the start of the 4th century AD that it began to take the place of papyrus in the manufacture of the best books, and works considered worth preserving were gradually transferred from papyrus roll to parchment codex. It is in this century that the great parchment codices of the Greek Bible, the Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, were prepared. Now again, we're using the traditional date there for Sinaiticus being a 4th century manuscript, okay? Were prepared. The earliest extant parchment manuscripts of pagan works probably date from the same century. But the use of papyrus did not cease then, and papyrus manuscripts of the New Testament have been found dating from the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. So what you see there is a transition, right? A slow transition out of the old technology of papyrus into the newer, more durable, form of writing on parchment that's taking place, okay? Scholars date Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus to the early 4th century AD. If these two codices are as old as scholars claim they are, it is in part due to the material on which they were written that they have traversed the seas of time and history. Parchment is vastly more durable than papyrus. Now, again, that's a fact. Whether you accept the dating that scholars give for these two unsealed codices, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, is a different matter. It's a fact that the papyrus would wear out much faster and not last as long as stuff that had been written on parchment. Okay? So before we get into the next point, you just need to understand some basic things about the materials that are used in the transmission of the text. Okay? Does anybody have any questions about those points? Fred?
Yeah, I'm trying to look it up, but didn't Paul, and I think it was in Timothy, one of the epistles, ask someone to bring him the books, especially the parchment?
Yeah.
That would have been 1st century.
Yeah, people get all bent out of shape about how the King James translators translated that word, and they say, oh, that shouldn't have been parchment because they weren't using parchment then, whatever.
I never heard a discussion out of it before, but I guess.
Everything I've read suggests that parchment came into use after papyrus. So even today, the earliest surviving documentation of the New Testament, whether it's all the papyri, are predating all of the parchment witnesses that we have. Okay? And we're going to get into some of that here in the next point. So witnesses to the New Testament text. So I'm on page 3. According to Metzger and Ehrman's textbook, quote, 3 classes of witnesses are available for ascertaining the text of the New Testament. They are Greek manuscripts, the ancient translations into other languages, and quotations of the New Testament made by the early ecclesiastical writers or church fathers. So they say there are 3 different types of witnesses to the New Testament text. The papyrus, the stuff that is written on parchment, or Greek manuscripts that are, and then the ancient translations, okay? And then they'll also talk about, I got confused there for a second. They got Greek manuscripts, the translations into other languages, and the quotations of the church fathers, okay? As of the 4th edition of the text of the New Testament printed in 2005, there were approximately 5,700 Greek manuscripts containing all or part of the New Testament. Now that's according to Metzger and Ehrman on page 52. More recent works, such as Dr. Jim Taylor's In Defense of the Textus Receptus, published in 2016, list the number of extant Greek manuscripts at 5,814. Okay? The higher number given by Taylor more than a decade later makes sense, given that manuscript finds no doubt occurred in the intermittent 10-year time frame, right? So you would expect a book written in 2005 to list fewer than a book written in 2016, understanding that in that intermittent 10 or 11 years, they're still finding what? They're still finding more witnesses or more manuscripts, okay? Now, these Greek manuscripts, and this is where I got a bit ahead of myself a moment ago. Greek manuscripts are usually broken down into the following 3 categories. The first are the papyri. Second is the majuscules or the uncials. And third is the minuscules, okay? And that's according again to Metzger and Ehrman. As the name suggests, the papyri are fragmentary Greek manuscripts written on papyrus, whereas the majuscules or minuscules were written on parchment in either all uppercase letters, as in the case of the uncials, those words are used interchangeably, or all lowercase letters, as in the minuscules or the cursives, okay? So, of all the Greek witnesses that are out there, they generally, according to Metzger and Ehrman, fall into 3 categories. They fall into the category of those written on papyrus, and then they fall into the category of those written on parchment, and then those written on parchment are of 2 different types depending on the handwriting that was used, whether they were copied using all uppercase script, or whether Greek script, or whether they were copied using lowercase Greek script. Okay? Does that make sense? When speaking about Greek manuscripts, textual critics frequently refer to text types or text families. This terminology is used to group together manuscripts containing similar characteristic readings. Okay? Now I've got the quote here from James White on this. Okay? Quote, basically a text type or text family refers to a grouping of manuscripts that share common readings or characteristics that distinguish them from other text types. Some manuscripts belong to more than one text type, for they have one kind of text in the Gospels and a different kind of text in Paul's writings or in the general epistles. The lines between the various text types that have been identified are often blurry. But in general, scholars have identified at least 3 and probably 4 text types in the New Testament. They are, number 1, the Alexandrian text type, found in most papyri and in the great unsealed codices, Aleph and B. Aleph is Sinaiticus. So if you're taking notes and you're not going to remember that, that's Aleph, that's Sinaiticus, and B is Vaticanus. Okay, so if you are looking at a critical edition and you see those 2 abbreviations, that's what it's referring to 2 specific documents. Okay? So the first is the Alexandrian text type found in most papyri and in the great unsealed codices Aleph and B, or Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. The Western text type is found in both Greek manuscripts and into translations of other languages, especially Latin. The Byzantine text type is found in the vast majority of later uncial and minuscule manuscripts. And then the Caesarean text type, disputed by some, is found in Papyrus 45 and in the family 1, which would be the Alexandrian. Okay? So again, listen, I've got books here. We could get lost in the weeds so easy on this stuff. I'm trying to keep it as simple as I can so that you get the point and can follow it, but that you're still understanding what's going on here. Okay? Then he says the following, White says the following, that should not be a capital S on as. As one can see from the names, these text types are tied to geographic locations. The Alexandrian is thought to originate in, or at least to have been predominant in the area around Alexandria, Egypt, where early church fathers such as Origen, Clement, and later Athanasius flourished. The Byzantine text type is found consistently in the area around Byzantium or Constantinople, and the Western, of course, refers to the western half of the Roman Empire. Though this one is a little less specific in nature, examples of this examples of this type defy precise geographic location. So what they do is they try to organize all of these 5,000 plus witnesses. They try to organize them based upon similar characteristic readings and geographic location. Okay? Now, it's not my point this morning to get into a long discussion about whether that's valid or not. We will do that at some point. Right now, I just want you to understand the terminology that people are using when they're talking about this subject matter, okay? So if you pick up a book and you look at it and they're talking about the Byzantine text type or the Alexandrian text type, you at least understand what they're talking about, okay? So if you look at the next point, contemporary disagreements. Now this is important. Between King James and modern version advocates are really a debate over which text type one is going to give the highest weight in transmitting the text. Okay? So, proponents of the critical text in modern versions give the highest weight to the Alexandrian text type. Proponents of the Textus Receptus and the King James Bible give the highest weight to the Byzantine text type as far as transmitting the text. Now I explain, okay? The Byzantine text type represents the vast majority of extant Greek manuscripts when compared numerically with the Alexandrian text type. So, in other words, which one of these text types numerically has the most number of witnesses? The Byzantine, okay? And as we'll see as we go through this, it's not even close. Okay? But the Alexandrian ones are perceived to be what? Older. And because the Alexandrian ones are perceived to be older, they are therefore, it is reasoned, closer to the original and are therefore more favorable witnesses according to the critical theory. Okay? Now remember what I've been saying for the last 3 lessons. How you approach all this stuff is going to depend upon your set of presuppositions that you're coming to this with and how you're going to evaluate the data. All right? So, the witnesses of the Alexandrian text type are older than those in the Byzantine tradition and are consequently viewed as closer to the originals and therefore more accurate by modern textual critics. James R. White sums up the situation in the following comments from the King James Only controversy. Now let me just say, the reason I'm quoting James White and Metzger and later Alon is just to demonstrate to people, not only you folks, but somebody that might be watching this after the fact, that I'm getting the base information here from sources that are ultimately not favorable to where I fall on this question. Okay? To demonstrate that I've read these sources and I'm aware of what they say. Okay? So White says, quote, the 2 ends of the spectrum, so to speak, are the Alexandrian and the Byzantine. The Alexandrian is more concise, while the Byzantine is the full, quote, full text. What does this mean? Most scholars today, in opposition to King James only advocates, would see the Alexandrian text type as representing an earlier and hence more accurate form of the text than the Byzantine text type. Most believe the Byzantine represents a later period in which readings from the other text types were put together or conflated into readings in the Byzantine text type. So in other words, the Byzantine text, according to them, is not pure. It's a combo text. Okay? It's not a pure text, it's a combo text that was cobbled together by taking witnesses from 2 text types, putting them together to create the Byzantine text. That's essentially what he's saying here. Okay? This is not to say that the Byzantine does not contain some distinctive readings that are quite ancient, but that the readings that are unique to the text type are generally secondary or late readings. Since the Byzantine comes from a later period, the earliest texts are almost all Alexandrian in nature, not Byzantine. It is fuller in the sense that it not only contains conflations of the other text types, but it gives evidence, now listen, it gives evidence of what can be called expansion of piety. That is, additions have been made to the text that flow from a desire to protect and reverence divine truths. Now, isn't that interesting? Because didn't we learn last week about Bart Ehrman and his supposition that Orthodox scribes purposely altered the text to strengthen Orthodox understanding of Christ? What is White essentially saying here? The same thing. And he's hanging that tag specifically on what text type? The Byzantine. Okay? So, and I have in brackets there, in other words, it was corrupted by Orthodox scribes. The Byzantine text represents the vast majority of the Greek manuscripts which we have available to us today. Okay? So, the question is really, what are you going to go with? The witness of the majority or the oldest witnesses? Okay? That's really the boiled down issue. Okay? King James advocate Dr. James Holland states the following in his book, Crowned with Glory, the Bible from Ancient Text to the Authorized Version. He says, quote, the Byzantine text is derived from the Byzantine Empire, and it is the type of text copied by Byzantine monks. There are more manuscripts of this text type than of the other 3 combined. This line of manuscripts reflect the Greek Textus Receptus that was used to produce the King James Version. It is also known as the traditional text or the Syrian text. The Alexandrian text, the name refers to Alexandria, Egypt, where scribes prepared most of these texts. Most contemporary versions are derived from this textual line. The 3 most important manuscripts that reflect this text type are Alexandrian, also known as Alexandrinus, Alexandrinus, also known as Codex A, from the 5th century. Sinaiticus, also known as Codex Aleph, from the 4th century. And Vaticanus, also known as Codex B, from the 4th century. Okay? So when they talk about the oldest and best, you guys already know this, they're referring to which two? They're referring to Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, both of which are of the Alexandrian text type, which are considered the two oldest witnesses. Two oldest and best. Okay? Once again, both sides of the Bible version debate are dealing with the same set of textual data. Yet they come to very different conclusions. Why? You should know the answer, right? Why? Because of how their governing presuppositions cause them to approach the text. If I'm going to say that the Bible is like any other book, then I'm going to use the same methodology to, quote, reconstruct the Bible that I would use for any other book. If I come to the issue with the presupposition that the Scriptures are preserved, then I should be looking at how the Scriptures should teach me how to think about how the preservation occurred. Okay? This is why we spent so much time covering these points in the last few lessons. Now, we are crunched for time because we got started late, but does anybody have any questions before we get into talking about each one of these types of witnesses a little further? Yeah?
You said the Alexandrian text was like 400 to 500 years after the time of Christ. What's the difference between the two time-wise?
So it's the answer to your, how about, let me get through all this, and then I think what I'm going to say is going to answer that.
Okay.
Is that fair?
Yes.
And then if I still haven't answered it, ask me again. Is that fair?
Okay, very good.
Okay. Anybody else? So the first thing I want to talk about is the papyri. Okay? Before the 1930s, the papyri were wholly unknown to textual critics. Now, I meant to bring my Westcott and Hort Greek text in here from 1881, and I forgot to do it. But so when Westcott and Hort create the Greek their Greek New Testament in 1881, they don't know anything about what? They don't know anything about the papyri. Okay? This, of course, means that when Westcott and Hort printed their famous critical edition of the Greek New Testament in 1881, they did so without an awareness of the papyri. They don't really even know that they're there or what they contain. All right? There are two important collections of papyri that were discovered in the 20th century. The first are the Chester Beatty papyri, which were first announced in 1931. And second is the Bodmer papyri, which were discovered in Egypt in 1952. Okay? While largely fragmentary in their witness, textual critics value the papyri because they predate the three great Alexandrian codices noted above and are reflective of the state of the text in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Okay? So, Andrew, you follow me here with the camera? So if Sinaiticus, Vaticanus are 4th century, and Alexandrinus is 5th century, the papyri are viewed as 2nd or what? 3rd. So in other words, the papyri are viewed as predating this information here. Okay, is everybody following that? All right. So where am I? Did I read?
Just end with
50-52, okay. So, quote, the Chester Beatty papyri and the Bodmer papyri are important not only for their age, but also for the length and character of their text. The great papyri should be introduced to students from the start because they are just as important and in many ways more important than the great unsealed manuscripts of the New Testament. So what is Alon saying there? He's saying these papyri are in some ways more important than these two guys right here because they're what? Older. Okay? So when you get into the papyri, are you getting further back? Okay, then even these will allow you to get. Is everybody following that? Okay. So I think I actually skipped that by accident. While largely fragmentary in their witness, textual critics value the papyri because they predate three great unsealed okay, got that. Dr. Floyd Nolan Jones provides the following statistical breakdown of the papyri. He says, quote, "We have 88 Greek papyri manuscripts." Now this number may be a bit dated now, I'm not totally sure. The papyri are of a newspaper type quality, unusually rolled out, but sometimes in book form. Unusually rolled, but sometimes in book form. Usually rolled, but sometimes in book form. Most papyri consist of small fragments and thus do not exhibit much text. Of the 88, an estimated 13 or 15% support B, that's Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, which are the two foremost manuscripts supporting the above-mentioned radical New Greek text. About 75 of the papyri, or 85%, support the Greek received text upon which the King James was founded. So that means, is there Byzantine witnesses in the papyri? So if there's Byzantine witnesses in the papyri, are the Byzantine readings just as old as the Alexandrian ones? So I think that answers your question. Okay? In 1984, Harry A. Sturz published an important book titled The Byzantine Text Type in New Testament Textual Criticism, in which he proved the presence of distinctly Byzantine readings in the papyri. Okay? For now, that's this book right here. This book is a monumental book. All right? This was written in 1984 by Harry A. Sturz, and it's absolutely essential book if you're going to look at these things. For now, we will limit ourselves to one summative quote. I could teach for probably 5 or 6 hours just on this book. Maybe I will. He says, quote, "Numerous, distinctly Byzantine readings now proved early would seem to reverse the burden of proof. Instead of assuming that characteristically Byzantine readings are late, it may be more logical and more in accord with the facts to assume that they are early. The burden of proof now appears to rest on whoever claims that a Byzantine reading is late. Furthermore, making textual decisions on the basis of how 3 or 4 old uncials read should be abandoned because they did not give a complete picture of 2nd century traditions." So let me tell you what he's saying. He's saying, yeah, these are old, and these may be Alexandrian, but there are distinctly Byzantine readings in these papyri. Yeah. If there's distinctly Byzantine readings in the papyri, then to argue on the basis of age that these two are the automatic best is a misuse of the facts. You following that? I know that? Okay, well, hopefully. Man, I could have quoted page after page of that book, but I'm not going to right now. Page 6. Majuscules or uncials. As stated above, majuscules are also known as uncials, worded in all capital letters on parchment. Famous manuscripts in this category include the following. Okay, Codex Vaticanus, 4th century. Codex Sinaiticus, 4th century, allegedly. Codex Vaticanus, 5th century, or Codex Alexandrinus. That should also say Alexandrinus, 5th century. Codex Ephraemi, 5th century, and Codex Beza, 5th century. In the absence of the papyri, these are the principal manuscripts that were utilized by Westcott and Hort to produce their critical edition in 1881. So in other words, when they produced their edition in 1881, do they have access to any of these papyri yet? No, because they're not known to text scholars until the 20th century. Okay? Once again, Floyd Nolan Jones provides the following statistical breakdown of the uncials. He says, quote, "We have 267 Greek uncials. Texts written in capital letters, also called majuscules, designated as manuscripts, or MSS. None of which is complete. Pages, chapters, and even books are missing. Of course, some are in much better condition than others. Only 9 of these support the Westcott and Hort critical text upon which the New Radical Greek text was based, merely 3%. Whereas 258, or 97%, support the Greek received text. That means that the majority of the papyri, as well as the majority of the uncials, favor which text?
Alexander.
Not the Alexandrian, they favor the what? The readings found in the Textus Receptus, or the traditional text. Philip Kaiser and William Pickering are co-authors of a booklet titled Has God Indeed Said? The Preservation of the Text of the New Testament. In this work, Kaiser and Pickering discuss the modern United Bible Society's text and its reliance upon uncial manuscripts of the Alexandrian text type. They say, quote, they usually gave primary weight to one Greek manuscript, B, known as Vaticanus. So what they're saying there is that when you look at the United Bible Society's text, the critical text as it exists now, and you look at the apparatus, they're saying that majority of the time, the textual evidence is based, the reason why they picked the reading they picked, is based upon the witness of how many manuscripts? One, and that one is Vaticanus, or B. So they usually gave primary weight to one Greek manuscript, B, known as Vaticanus. Even when every other Egyptian or Byzantine manuscript supports a different reading. So even when the mass of preponderance of the evidence says otherwise, they still went with what? Vaticanus. Okay? Though there are 5,262 Greek manuscripts currently extant and tens of thousands of early versions, the following manuscripts carried the most weight in the United Bible Society's text. Number one, 90% of the time these editors base their reading on the primary weight of only one Greek manuscript, Vaticanus. In practical terms, this is the manuscript authority. Second, another 7% of the time, their disagreement with the majority text is based upon a reading found in Sinaiticus. We have already seen that Sinaiticus disagrees with Vaticanus well over 3,000 times in the Gospels alone. This shows that one or both manuscripts are highly unreliable. 2.5% of the time, their distinctive reading is based on Alexandrinus. Less than 0.5% of the time, the readings of modern versions are based on other Alexandrian manuscripts when one or more of them disagree with the previous three. There are about 200 Alexandrian manuscripts. Now, what is their point? Their point that even in the modern critical text, there's really only one authority, and it's what? Vaticanus. And this is based upon a statistical breakdown of what's going on. Is everybody understanding what I'm saying? Majuscules or cursives. The lowercase manuscripts comprise the majority witness of the Byzantine text types. I'm on the top, page 7. As already noted, these manuscripts are not as old as the unsealed codices listed above and are therefore viewed as secondary witnesses to the New Testament text by modern textual critics. Consider the words of the following famous 19th century textual critics regarding the Byzantine text and the Textus Receptus. In 1831, Karl Lachmann published his Greek New Testament, which was the first to completely lay aside the Textus Receptus, regarding which Lachmann stated, quote, down with the late text of the Textus Receptus and back to the early 4th century. Now, when he says that, what does he mean? He means these Byzantine texts are late. We need to go back where? Back to these guys. Okay? 1851, December 29 and 30. In a letter to Reverend John Ellington, Hort calls the Textus Receptus vile and villainous. He says, quote, think of that vile Textus Receptus leaning entirely on late manuscripts. It is a blessing that there are such early ones. Okay? We still recording? Okay. 1853, April 19. In a letter to Reverend John Ellington, Hort announces his joint plan with Westcott to edit a Greek New Testament based upon material provided by Lockman and Tischendorf. He says, quote, "He and I," referring to Westcott, "he and I are going to edit a Greek text of the New Testament some 2 or 3 years hence, if possible. Lockman and Tischendorf will supply rich materials, but not nearly enough, and we hope to do a good deal with Oriental versions." Now watch. Our object is to supply clergymen, generally, schools, etc., with a portable Greek text which shall not be disfigured with Byzantine corruptions. Okay, so what's their attitude toward this class of manuscripts? Okay, they are to be discredited because they are not what? Old. Okay. In terms of majuscules, Dr. Jones, that's not Indiana Jones, okay, that's... Dr. Jones states, quote, "There are 2,746 Greek cursive manuscripts written in small letters designated by the small case MSS." He's referring there to how he does it in his book. "Often called minuscules. Thus, most of the Greek witnesses to the text of the New Testament are the Greek cursives. Merely 23, 1%, sustain the Westcott and Hort readings, which are the Greek foundation for nearly all modern versions, while 2,741, 99%, uphold the Textus Receptus, or the received text. Okay? So again, in every category, the vast majority of the evidence that we have points toward the Byzantine text, not toward what? The Alexandrian text, and Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. Ancient versions. Ancient versions comprise another witness to the New Testament text. From very early in church history, the scriptures were being translated into the vernacular languages of the people. Paying attention to the readings contained in these versions reveals what type of text was being translated. While the surviving version evidence is not as clear-cut as some might hope, there is strong evidence that Byzantine manuscripts existed and served as the textual basis for vernacular translations of the New Testament from very early in church history. Now, we will talk more about this in another lesson. Some prominent ancient versions include, but are not limited to, the following: the Old Syriac, the Peshitta, the Old Latin, the Latin Vulgate, the Coptic, Gothic, Armenian, Georgian, Ethiopic, Old Slavonic, there you go, Slavonic, Arabic, and Anglo-Saxon. So in other words, is the Bible being translated in all these different languages? Okay? If you look at the readings that are found in these translations, you can understand what they had in front of them when they were doing the translation. Did they have a Byzantine type reading in front of them when they translated, or did they have an Alexandrian type reading in front of them when they what? Translated. Okay? And I have Romans 16, 25 and 26 in here as a example. Paul says in Romans 16, 25 and 26, he says, "Now to him that has the power to establish you according to my gospel, and the preaching of Jesus Christ according to the revelation of the mystery, which was kept secret since the world began, but now is made manifest, and by the scriptures of the prophets, according to the commandment of the everlasting God." Now watch, here's the part I want. "Made known to who? All nations. All nations, for the obedience of faith." What does that mean? That means, does God want all men to know the fellowship of the mystery? Ephesians chapter 3. Yep. How's that going to be accomplished? One of the ways that's going to be accomplished is through the translation of the Word of God into the languages of the nations. Okay? You get that for me? I'm almost done. Then we have 4 patristic quotations. Besides textual evidence derived from the Greek manuscripts and from early versions, the text critic also has available the numerous scriptural quotations included in the commentaries, sermons, and other treatises written by the early church fathers. Indeed, so extensive are these citations that if all other sources for our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, they would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. So what does that mean? That means are the church fathers in their writings extensively quoting the Greek New Testament. Now, you can look at what readings are they quoting. Are they quoting uniquely Byzantine readings, or are they quoting Alexandrian readings in their writings? So you have that witness as well. The New Testament quotations found in the writings of the church fathers constitute yet another source of information concerning the history of the New Testament text. Some of the most important fathers for the purposes of textual criticism are as follows. I'm not going to read all that. But what Hills is basically saying, again, is that the church fathers are another source of information regarding the text. Okay? And the reason I'm skipping that is because I want to get to the end of this. Lectionaries. When one considers the data pertaining to the lectionaries as a witness to the New Testament text, it is curious why Metzger and Ehrman left them out of their listing of Greek attestation. If you remember back to the earlier part of the lesson, they mention three things. Greek manuscripts, papyri, and then they mention Greek manuscripts, and under that category they talk about the papyri, the uncials, and the cursives. But they don't talk about what? They don't talk about the lectionaries. Okay? So, why might that be? Regarding the lectionaries, Floyd Nolan Jones stated the following. He said, quote, "We also have 2,143 Greek lectionaries, from a Latin root meaning to read, manuscripts containing scripture lessons that were read publicly in the church from at least AD 400 until the invention of printing. All, 100% of them support the received text which underlies the King James Bible. That gives us a total of 5,262 Greek witnesses to the true text of the New Testament, of which 5,217 or 99% are in agreement. This group dates from the 5th century on. The remainder not only disagree with the 99% majority, but disagree among themselves. Nonetheless, these few have controlled the camp of academia for the past 100 years. So why would you not talk about the lectionaries? Because it points in a direction you don't want it to point. That's why. Okay? So the conclusion. All of this highlights what Edward F. Hills meant in the following quotation from Lesson 70. He said, quote, "Thus there are two methods of New Testament textual criticism, the consistently Christian method and the naturalistic method. These two methods deal with the same material, the same Greek manuscripts, the same translations and biblical quotations, but they interpret those materials differently." This is the point I've been trying to get you to see for the last 3 lessons, okay? The consistently Christian method interprets the materials of New Testament textual criticism in accordance with the doctrines of divine inspiration and providential preservation of the Scriptures. The naturalistic method interprets the same materials in accordance with its own doctrine that the New Testament is nothing more than a human book. I hope stuff is starting to fall into place for you here as I try to lay all this out, okay? So, how one uses the above data to arrive at an understanding of what the New Testament is or ought to be is completely dependent upon their presuppositions and the resulting, that might work, and the resultant approach to textual criticism. Put another way, the biblical presupposition that God promised to preserve His Word leads to one evaluation of the data, whereas the use of neutral or naturalistic presuppositions leads to a completely different evaluation and understanding of the data and consequently the text. Clear as mud, right? Is everybody following that? Okay? To illustrate the point, Please consider the following chart presented by Kaiser and Pickering, along with the accompanying quotes. They say, quote, "The following chart from Floyd Nolan Jones' book illustrates the degree of conformity that 4 types of manuscripts, papyri, fragments, uncials, cursives, and lectionaries have to either the majority text or to Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, the primary text underlying most modern translations." So look at the data. There's 88 total papyri. 13 of them, 15% support Aleph and B, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. 75% or 85 support the majority. The uncials, all caps, 267 total. 3% support Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. 258, 97% support the majority. The cursives, the lowercase, total 2,746. 23 of them support Aleph and B. That's 1%, whereas 2,741 or 99% support the majority. In the lectionaries, there are 2,143 lectionaries. None of them support Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. All of them, 100% support the majority. So you have the total. 99% of the surviving Greek evidence supports the Byzantine majority against the Alexandrian minority. Okay? This chart shows that the majority text is truly majority. The majority is also equally old to the supposed oldest and best, referred to in the ancient versions. It also represents the widest geographic distribution across Greece, Asia Minor, Constantinople, Syria, Africa, Gaul, southern Italy, Sicily, England, and Ireland. In contrast, the text that modern versions are based on is found in Egypt, a place that had no letters sent to it, but where most of the early heresies originated. Okay? So, we have the materials, we have the types of witnesses. Now, I gave you some analysis in this, so that you could think it through a little bit. Okay? I could have produced quotes from 15 different books that I have on these things. Okay? The majority witness of the Byzantine is reflective of a text that is just as old, with attestation of the papyri. Sturz proves this, okay? That is just as old as these, if not what? Older. And the vast majority of everything that we have, as far as surviving Greek witnesses, support the Byzantine majority, not the Alexandrian minority. Okay? So how did we get to a place where the vast majority was laid aside in favor of the minority? It was because of a seed shift that happened in the 19th century because of a rationalistic response to German higher criticism and rationalism. I've already showed you this, right? That when Warfield decides to limit inspiration and inerrancy, inspiration and inerrancy to the original autographs, he does that because he is taking up his opponent's argument on ground that has been set by his opponents. A rhetorical move that he did not need to make. Okay, now I'm sorry we don't have more time. It's already 5 minutes past. I have to go out there and get set up for what we're doing next. So if you have questions, which I'm sure you probably do, make sure you ask me them or write them down so that we can get into them. Now, I do believe I got to your question. I think I got to your question, right? So we're good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.